Welcome to Table for One. I'm the narrator, and in today's rules refresher video, I'm going to be talking about Voidfall. In this video, I'm going to tell you everything you need to know rules-wise about agendas and trade tokens. Let's get rolling. Alright, so I'm set up now to talk about agendas and trade tokens and how to use them in Voidfall. So I'm partially set up here. I've got everything I need for this video for a fictional game of Voidfall. So I've selected House Marqualos, and let's get started. So when you set up the game, you're going to get two of these origin cards, and you choose which one that you want to select for the house that you're playing. So for House Marqualos, there's always an A and a B. A is autonomous drones in this case, and B is trade nexus. So you pick which way you want to start, which starting tech you get. Let's just pretend that I follow all the setup instructions on the card. I'm not going to bother with that right now, so we'll do autonomous drones. Let's pretend that I follow all these setup instructions. You take this origin card, and you flip it over, and that is your starting agenda. And you'll notice up here, it's got the agenda symbol, and it is in white. And if you look at the player mat down here at the bottom, this is where the agenda slots are. One of them is white, the other three are this dark purple color. So you take this first agenda, your starting agenda, and you slot it right there in that spot. So your agenda slots can be corrupted, and we'll talk about that in a little bit. You start with a corruption on your last agenda slot, or really any of these three, it doesn't really matter which. But this one has a symbol that it can never be corrupted. So your starting agenda can never be corrupted. And this is going to do a couple things for you. So this agenda here will give you points at the end of each cycle, as all agendas do. That's really their main function, is to give you victory points, which is called influence in this game. So the more influence you get, the better, because that's how you win the game, is by having the most. So this particular card will score at the end of each cycle for your peer sectors with sector defenses, and your peer sectors with shipyards. Now, House Marqualos I picked for this example because they also do something special. They also get a second starting agenda, and we'll talk about why in a moment. So there's an A side and a B side. So we picked starting origin A. So we also get the second agenda on the A side, and that slots into any of these spots. So I'll talk about more about this specific one. All the other houses only start with the starting agenda that's on the back of the origin card. House Marqualos is a little special that they get the second one, so I'll come back to that in a minute. So the agenda offer is this area right here, and you may notice I've got these different trays. They probably look a little different than yours. These are from Etsy. There's a link in the description, so I'm not going to spend a lot of time on that, but you set it up just like this. The order of these does matter. So this symbol on top, this is support. This one is might, wealth, and dominance. Those are the four agenda types. And you'll notice this cardboard piece, that regardless of what version of the game, you've always got this cardboard piece. The symbols go down the middle here. So you just line them up with the matching symbols. Now each of these decks has 8 cards in it. You're going to put 7 here on the left, and the last one face up on the right side. So as I mentioned earlier, agenda cards are the main way that you generate influence in this game, which is sort of the goal of the entire game. That's how you're going to win. So naturally, it makes sense to want to know, how are you going to gain these cards? So let's talk about that first. Now, probably the most common way to get them is through your focus actions. So we'll just find one here. Here's innovation, which we'll come back to again in a minute. It's this symbol here. So if I take this action, I pay 1 food, 1 energy, and 1 material, and then I can gain 1 agenda card. So if I can gain 1 agenda card, and it's a generic symbol like this, which it typically is, I can choose which type of card that I want, from which of these 4 stacks. Again, either support, might, wealth, or dominance, and I can take 1 card. I'll come back to that process in a moment. Another way you can gain an agenda card is by advancing your civilization track. So if we look at this one here, if you get to tier 3 of the economic track for House Marqualos, you can gain an agenda card and a trade token, which I'll talk about those in a little bit. Now, if you look at the statecraft track here, This symbol says you can gain an agenda card, but specifically it must be the support type. So you have to take this type of agenda card in that case. Now you can also gain agenda cards through your techs, through galactic events. There's a handful of ways to get those, but that's sort of how you'll encounter it in this game. So let's say it's time to take a agenda card and you want a dominance agenda, which is this bottom type. You have two options when you take your card. You can either take this face-up card here, and then it's yours. It goes into your hand. And if you do that, you take the next card and flip it over to replace it. The other option, let's put this back and put this here. This one's face up. You can look at it and you can say, I don't really want that particular card. And we'll talk about why that is in a moment. But if you don't want that one, your other option is to take the next two face down cards, look at them. And this is one of the only cases of semi-secret information in this game. You don't have to share this with the other players. But you look at the next two cards. You choose which one you want. You take it into your hand and you put the other one on the bottom of that stack. And then this one just stays right there. So in either case, you come away with one card and it goes into your hand. All right, so why might you want to choose one particular agenda card over another? Well, it's all about this bottom section down here. I think every agenda card in the game, let's just flip through a couple of these. All right, so that's like an interesting example. So we'll keep that one too. The format is typically this. There'll be two ways you can score points at the end of every cycle. On the left, it'll just be a simple yes or no. So this one says if you have 2 or more pure sectors with 5 population or more, you gain 4 influence. So if you have it, you gain it. If you don't have it, you don't get the points. On the right is usually some type of multiplier. So in this particular example, if your statecraft track is pure, whatever tier it is, multiply its tier number by 4. So if you're in tier 0, you get no points. If you're in tier 4, you get 16 points. And you can do the math in between. So typically it's, like I said, just a simple yes, no, and then some type of multiplier. This one is a little unusual. It's sort of the same format. There's a simple yes, no, and then there's multiple multipliers. So depending on what you're doing, this one rewarded you for an advanced statecraft track. Maybe you're advancing your econ track. So instead of taking this one, you might want to dig through there and see if you can find one that rewards you for an econ track or rewards you for something else that fits with the strategy that you're currently pursuing. So that's sort of how all these cards work. But again, we'll say we have one of these in my hand. Having it in your hand doesn't do anything. You don't gain any points for the cards in your hand. You can only score agenda cards that are in play, that are docked into the bottom of your player mat here. So once you've got an agenda card in your hand, how do you get it into play? That's going to happen on the beginning of one of your future turns. So there's a couple symbols here. They're also on the top left of each card. These symbols match the symbols on the top of your focus cards here. So this one that we took into our hand, this dominance agenda, it matches the symbol cards for temptation and innovation. So in order to put your agenda card into play, you need to play one of those focus cards. Now you don't have to do it, that the card that you took, the agenda card you took, stays in your hand in theory through the whole game, and there's no hand limit for agenda cards. So you can have multiples of the same type in your hand. You can have all sorts of agenda cards in your hand, but they don't do anything in your hand. You have to play them to get any benefit. So let's say we play, we'll go back to innovation. Let's say we play this innovation card on our turn. If we have an agenda card in our hand, maximum of 1 at a time, so we may have 2 dominance cards in our hand, we can only play 1 at a time. But if you have one that matches that symbol, so this one goes with innovation, you can play it simultaneously with this card. And it gives you an action, which is the top right portion of this card. And so normally, without any modifiers or anything, when you take your turn, you pick 2 of the actions on your focus card, you pay for them, and then you get the action that's listed. When you play an agenda card with it, you also, for free, get this action at the top, and you can take it before either of these actions, in between the 2 actions, or after you're done taking your actions on your focus card. You choose when. You just can't take this action in the middle of other actions. You got to resolve one, resolve the other. You can't take it midway through, but it's a free action. So all of the cards of any one type will have the same action, and they will be played with the same type of cards. So all of the dominance cards can be played with either temptation or innovation. That's always the case. And your free action is always going to be this invade action. So if we move up to the wealth cards, they're always played with production or development. And the free action is always place one guild and produce resources of whatever type of guild that was. So if you place a farmer's guild, you produce food. Moving up, the might agenda always gets played with either prosperity focus cards or progress. And you have a choice on your action. You can either advance your lowest civilization track, and if there's a tie, like in this case, you'd get to choose which one. But if it, for example, looked like this, I would have to choose between statecraft and economy, or statecraft and civilization. I couldn't choose economy because it's already higher. So whatever your lowest track is, you can advance it, or your other option is gain a trade token, so you get to choose in that case. And finally, the support agendas get played with conquest or reinforcement. And your free action there is you can activate one fleet power, so you move it from your inactive to your active on your player mat, and you can establish one installation of your choice. So it's generally going to be a shipyard or a sector defense. Unless you have star-based technology, then it can be a star-base. So a couple things to consider when you're selecting an agenda card. One, of course, is the scoring criteria. We kind of talked about that already. So which type of scoring criteria fits with the strategy that you're currently pursuing. The second thing is, what's the free action, and does that help you in some way to achieve what you're trying to achieve? And that should not be discounted. I use this wealth agenda sometimes not even for the points, but just because it'll get me the resources by placing a guild and then producing, and that can keep me, working on my strategy without maybe having to play a different focus card. And then the third thing to consider, of course, is what focus cards do you still want to play, and does that line up with these agenda cards? Because it doesn't help you to take a wealth agenda if you've already played development and production this cycle, and you're not going to be able to play it now until next cycle. Do you want to hold on to it that long? Maybe your next move is going to be conquest, so maybe it'd be better to just take that one so you can get a free action right away. So as usual, there's a lot of things to consider. Now, you may have noticed each of these agenda cards can be played with 2 different types of focus cards, but of course there are 9 standard focus cards. So the one that is not represented is politics. None of the agenda cards can ever be played with politics. It's just not possible. So if you play the politics card, there is no agenda that matches it. So that's, I guess, another thing to consider when you're playing the politics card is, do you have any agendas that you're trying to get out? Because this isn't going to help you do it. Now, I did this a little bit on purpose, but so we said we played this card with innovation, but I am playing as House Marqualos, and as part of setup for House Marqualos, you replace your innovation card with this special focus card called Scheme. Now, normally innovation cannot be played in cycle 1. That's a cycle 2 or 3 card only. But for Marqualos, you replace it with this, which does not have that restriction, which is super cool. So you can play Scheme in any cycle. But if I bring it back here, you'll notice that the symbol on the card is different than the innovation symbol. It's not an innovation card, it's a scheme card, which means it cannot be played with this agenda. So if you have this dominance agenda type, you can only, when you're playing as House Marqualos, play it with temptation. There is no innovation card in your hand to ever play it with. So in contrast, let's say I'm playing as House Thegwin. House Thegwin has one replacement focus card, and it replaces production, but it replaces production with this special production card, and it maintains that same symbol. So if you're playing with House Thegwin and you play this production card, you can still pair it with a wealth agenda because this production symbol matches. So now let's go back to our example, and we'll take out the temptation card. We'll say that I've played temptation because House Marqualos does not have an innovation card. So we've paired these together. We've taken our couple actions on here. We've taken this action. Our turn is over. So now during the cleanup step of our focus, this, of course, gets discarded. This card, we have an option now. So there's a couple things we can do. We could just take it if you don't want it, and you can put it on the bottom of this pile, and that's it. Then it's just gone, no problem. Of course, if you do that, you won't get any points for it at the end of each cycle. So if you want to get those points, you can slot this card into the bottom of your player mat. There's just a couple of restrictions on that. So first I'll say you can slot it in any open slot, even if there's corruption. Corruption does not prevent you from putting a card in that slot. We'll talk about what corruption does in a little bit, but you can use that slot. That's not a big deal. What you cannot do is have more than one agenda card of the same type slotted. So if I've got this, and on a future turn, I get another one of these dominance agendas, I cannot put it here. because you cannot have two dominants because of the same type. So that's a situation where you might look at the card in your hand and its scoring prospects, or I guess not in your hand because you've played it. But when you're at the end of your turn, you're at cleanup, you look at the scoring prospects of this card, and you look at the scoring prospects of the card that's already slotted, and then you may replace the old one with the new one if you like, and then the old one goes on the bottom of the stack. Or if you decide that you like your old one still and you just wanted this one for the action, that's fine. That's a time when you might just take it at the end of your turn during cleanup and you discard it to the bottom without messing with this one at all. So I said you may not have more than one agenda of the same type. Your starting agenda card, which goes here, has no type, so it will never prevent you from slotting any of these agenda cards up here. And if you're playing as House Marqualos, you get this extra agenda. This has no type, so again, it never blocks you from slotting any of these agendas. Now, to be frank, this agenda, the second one that you get from House Marqualos, kind of stinks, but the reason they gave it to you is because on this special focus card scheme, the second action, transfer, the cost for the action is you must discard a slotted agenda. So, like I said, this one kind of stinks, but it allows you to discard it. It's now out of the game, and then you can take this action, which is a pretty good action. And then that'll open up this slot for something else later. Okay, so I said that you can slot agendas into corrupted spots. Now, you're probably only going to do that if your other spots are full, and then you get another agenda, and you have nowhere else to slot it. So what does this corruption do? Now, of course, it's used for calculating skirmishes, and I've got a whole video on that. But at the end of the cycle, when you get to score your agendas, you may only score your pure agendas. So you can score this one, and this one, but you can't score this one because it's corrupted. So that's something to consider when you're either taking corruption. If I've got an empty mat like this and I have to take a corruption, I might choose to corrupt this one because I don't expect it to score as well as some of these. And that's also something to consider when slotting an agenda into a spot. So I don't know if it looked maybe like this and I got a new agenda. I'd probably want to put it here, not here, just to have a better chance of scoring it at the end of the cycle. Now, while we're talking about corruption and agendas, you may have noticed these 4 slots on this tile here. Those slots can also hold corruption. Now, this is not your player area, so if you ever have the opportunity, like here, to remove a corruption, you cannot remove from here. There are a handful of game effects that'll have you add corruption to the agendas. But the only way to get it off of there is if you take that agenda type, either this one or one of the top 2 here, when you take it, you must also take this corruption, and then you can place it on one of your open agenda slots, on one of your civilization tracks, or on one of your pure sectors that can hold a corruption. So basically at that time it goes from being a corruption that doesn't belong to anyone to a corruption that now belongs to you. And you have to take that immediately when you gain that agenda card into your hand. Now, one last note about this board here. As great as the iconography is in this game, this is not my favorite part. But what they're trying to tell you here is, here's the 4 types of agendas. These are the types of focus cards you can play each agenda type with. And then obviously this is where you would hold a corruption. And it's telling you if you take one of that agenda type, you also take the corruption. This part on the right is the part that bugs me a little bit. But what it's trying to convey is these are the types of things that these types of cards will likely give you points for. So some of the better examples are if you're going real heavy on technologies and especially improved technologies, you might want to get a wealth agenda so that you can score for those technologies. Or if you're advancing your civilization tracks really high and really well, civilization tracks are generally rewarded point-wise in this dominance agenda type. But you got to be cautious. I use the word generally because, for example, there are some really great cards that I like in this wealth agenda that reward for bounty tokens and reclaim tokens, and you won't find that information on here. So these are not exhaustive lists. They're just meant to be guides. On your 4 agenda slots, again, this is your starting agenda. The starting agenda, now that we've kind of covered it, can never be corrupted. It's a reminder. And it can never be discarded. You can't get rid of that starting agenda and slot it with a different type. This one you're going to have for the whole game. Now, one more thing about agendas before we move on, we need to talk about Upkeep. And Upkeep, I've got a whole video on. There's a link in the description, but essentially each a slotted agenda card that you have adds 2 to your upkeep obligation at the end of each cycle. It doesn't matter if there's corruption on the slot or not. As long as it's a slotted agenda card, it adds 2 to your upkeep. So at a high level, that just means you're going to have to pay more resources. And if you cannot afford those resources, you're going to be losing influence, which is bad. Because that's sort of the whole point of these cards, is to gain influence. Now, if you can't afford your upkeep, it doesn't affect your ability to score these agendas, but if you can't afford your upkeep, I hope that the influence that you lose is a smaller number than the influence that you gain from scoring these agendas, otherwise they're not worth it. Now, that's going to put pressure on your resources, so you probably would rather not pay that upkeep if you had the option, and there is a way to do that, and that is with trade tokens. So let's get into the second half of the video here. These are trade tokens. Now, right now, this is set up for a solo game. This is table for one after all, but as a quick reminder, it doesn't matter which side of the board you use, whether you're using the solo or co-op side or the opposite side, which is for competitive. This is how you would set up. So on this side, only a solo game, you put 1 trade token on each of these top 5 slots, and this one is empty. For all 2-player games, you add 1 more for this bottom slot as well. For all 3-player games, you leave the bottom slot open, but each of these are stacked 2 high. And for 4-player games, you fill all 6 slots and they're all 2 high. So right now I've just got them stacked 1 high. I'll put this off to the side because this is a solo game, so let's just assume it's set up like this. So you can gain trade tokens in a variety of ways, similar to gaining an agenda card. So since the scheme card is out, the second action, one of the things it allows you to do is gain a trade token. You'll also see this agenda type can allow you to gain a trade token. Some of the texts, this one here lets you either gain a trade token or gain an agenda. So here on the tracks, you can gain a trade token. So there's a number of ways to gain trade tokens. So if you're in the middle of your turn, and you take this action, and one of the things it lets you do is gain a trade token. You take the bottommost trade token from this board. So if they're stacked 2 high, take it from the bottom. I'm saying this is the top, and then this is the bottom. Take it from the bottommost where you can. So if there were, for example, 2 here, you'd have to take one of these. If there was 2, 2, 2, 2, and 1, you would have to take the 1. So I hope that makes sense. But you take the bottommost. So let's go back to a solo game. I take this. And then there's this action on the right. So this lets you gain a bounty token. You don't have to take that action specifically. But instead, when you gain the trade token, you can take that action or any of the actions below it. So as this board starts to empty out and people take trade tokens, when I take this one, I can either activate a fleet power, gain 2 credits, gain 2 science, gain 2 resources in any combination of food, materials, and energy, gain a bounty token, or gain 1 science. I can take whatever of those options that I want. All right, so this trade token that I've just gained, technically you can spend it on some very specific use cases, which I'll come back to in a moment. Typically, you can't do anything with it though. So let's say I play out the rest of my turn, I finish playing Scheme, and now I'm doing the cleanup of my turn. I've got this trade token here. I need to put this somewhere if I want to keep it. If I have nowhere to put it, then I have to send it back to the galactic board right away. So where can you store these? Well, you can store them. If you look at the shape of this, it matches the shape on the bottom of your agenda cards. Each one of these agenda cards can hold 1 trade token. So the more agenda cards you get slotted, the more trade tokens you can hold. And it sits right there and it covers up those 2 upkeep. And so at the end of the cycle, when it comes time to pay for upkeep, you don't have an obligation to pay those 2 upkeep anymore. Those are already covered. All right, so that all sounds great. So what can trade tokens do for you then? Why would you ever want to take it off of there? Well, if you play your next focus card later, if you already have, at the time that you put the focus card down, a trade token on your agendas or another legal space, you can spend it. And you spend it by taking it and flipping it over, and it's going to be hard to see, but on the back side it says +1, and it has the focus card on it. And by flipping that over, you are allowed to take all 3 actions on your focus card. So instead of picking any 2 of these and taking them in any order, you can take all 3 in any order. And this would be a nice scenario where one of them nets you a new trade token. So let's go ahead and let's say that I did this action and I did this action, and now I'm doing the third. So I pay my credit, I move a corruption, and I take a trade token. I take this one, gain any of these bonuses, and now at the end of the turn, this one must go back to the lowest space available, and this one now needs to find a home on my player board. So you'll have to kind of decide at the beginning of each turn, is it better for you to take 3 actions now, or is it better for you to keep that upkeep covered up so you don't have to pay that upkeep obligation later? Now, one thing that's really important is, let's say I have no trade tokens, and I play politics, and I take this action here at the bottom first. So I gain this, I spend 1 credit, I move a corruption, and I gain a trade token. What I'm not allowed to do is I cannot then flip this trade token to take all 3 actions on this focus card. This focus card's already in play. You must have a trade token already at the time you play the card in order to flip it over and use it to take all 3 actions. So if you gain it, you can't use it that time on that card. But there are a couple of texts that we should talk about as well that interact with trade tokens and with agenda cards as well. So I've got those here. And the first one that I want to talk about is escape pods. So this is associated with House Valnus. So if you have escape pods, first of all, when you gain it, you also gain a trade token, which is nice. But one of the effects is you may have 1 additional trade token. So let's say it's the beginning of the game, and I only have 1 agenda, which is pretty typical. I've gained a trade token, and it's sitting there. And now on my next turn, I gain this tech, and it allows me to gain a trade token. So I take another one, pick the bonus that I want, and then by slotting this, I can store 1 extra trade token right there on my card. So when it comes time for another turn, I can choose to spend this one or this one. And by spending this one, I keep my upkeep covered, so that can be really beneficial. So that's escape pods. Now, Trade Nexus is kind of straightforward. We'll talk about that one. This one is with House Marqualos. It's it's Origin B. For Trade Nexus, this is pretty cool. When you return a trade token to the galactic board, so say we've used it to take all 3 actions here, at the end of the turn, when we return it, you may also gain the trade bonus. So when I put it back, if I put it back in this spot here, I can then choose to gain a bounty token or 1 science. If there were fewer trade tokens on there at the time, if I put my trade token away and it goes here, I can pick this bonus or any of the bonuses below. And that's, again, 1 bonus. I can't take all of them, but you can pick which one you want for Trade Nexus. So that's pretty nice that you gain the bonus when you put the trade token away also. On Improved Trade Nexus, it says the first time you overproduce a resource each turn, you may gain 3 influence, or, and that's typical, or you can gain a trade token without getting a trade bonus. So you can just get an extra token. You don't get to pick a bonus, but now you've got it and you can use it for later. So that's a benefit from the Improved Trade Nexus. Now, we started with Marqualos A, and that would be autonomous drones, and that one's worth talking about too. This one uses trade tokens a little bit differently in a combat sense. So this says you may spend 1 trade token to gain 1 approach absorption and 1 salvo absorption. So that's pretty powerful. So let's say I played this politics card. My first action, and I don't have any trade tokens. My first action is I'm going to gain a trade token, and then, gain the bonus. So I've got this here. I can't flip it to take a 3rd action here, but I do own it at this point. If my second action is this one and I invade, I can spend this trade token right now to gain that approach and salvo absorption. So you do have it in your possession at that point and can spend it for things like this. So it's not super common. It comes up sometimes maybe on crisis cards, but it is something to be aware of. So we'll put this back. And then the last one that we should talk about is more to do with agendas. This is Central Surveillance, and this is associated with House Fenrax. So on the basic Central Surveillance, when you play the Politics focus card, this one here, which is generally not associated with any of these agenda types, it says you may decrease 1 pure population, not in your home sector, and then gain an agenda card. So that brings Politics into play agenda-wise, where even though you still can't play a card with it, when you play it, you can gain an agenda, which is not normally one of the actions. Now, Improved Central Surveillance is pretty neat. When you gain the card, you can spend 2 energy to gain an agenda. You still get the Politics bonus from basic Central Surveillance, but also you may have 1 additional agenda in play. So if these are the main source of gaining influence and trying to win the game, that's super helpful because you can only have one of each type if you recall. There are 4 types, and you've typically got these 3 slots. So with this card, the Improved Central Surveillance, you can have one of each type in play, and that can really multiply your points, especially if you can get that card into play earlier, because again, they always score at the end of each cycle. So the agendas you play in cycle 1 will be scored 3 times, whereas the agendas you get into play in cycle 3 will only be scored once. Now, one other thing I forgot to mention about agendas before I moved on is if you're playing solo, there's this heroic focus card deck. I'm not going to go into the mechanics of it, but there's heroic focus cards. And if you're playing co-op, then there are joint focus cards. And basically these cards can be used to replace one of your focus cards of the matching type. So this heroic progress can be played in place of your progress card. But there are 10 of these, and you only have 9 standard focus cards. The 10th is leadership. So it's either heroic leadership or joint leadership. And this can be played in place of any of your standard focus cards, including your special ones. So in this situation, I could discard Scheme to play Heroic Leadership, right? The reason I mention it is leadership pairs with all agenda types. So if you have any agenda in your hand, you can play it with Heroic Leadership or Joint Leadership. So that's everything you need to know, and probably more than you ever wanted to know, about agenda cards and trade tokens and how you can and can't use them in Voidfall. So I hope that's been useful to you. I hope it helps you understand the game. I hope it answers your questions. If there's something I didn't cover, or if there's something I made more confusing for you, let me know. I'd be happy to try and address it in the future. But other than that, let me let you get back to playing Voidfall. So if you're still here, thank you. Please consider subscribing, sharing it, leaving a like, and leaving comments. I love the comments. Those are the best, because I like talking to all of you. So thanks for being here. This is Table for One, and I will see you next time.